She wore a tailored charcoal jumpsuit that suggested she was ready for business, though the way her gaze locked onto Blue's had nothing to do with her day job. She leaned against the doorframe, watching them with a mix of maternal pride and something sharper, more urgent. "The kids are getting obsessed with your science projects, Blue," Tiffany said, her voice a low, melodic purr. She walked over, placing a hand on the edge of the workbench. "They're natural engineers, Tiff," Blue replied, keeping his eyes on the volcano. "We're about to demonstrate the endothermic reaction, the rapid release of carbon dioxide. Dash, grab the baking soda. Peanut, prepare the trigger." While the kids focused on the delicate task of balancing the powders, Tiffany drifted closer to Blue. She leaned in, her proximity making the air feel thin. "You've been here for 3 days, and the house feels different," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of jars. "I thought you were leaving tomorrow. Is this just another stop on your little map?" Blue turned slightly, his shoulder brushing hers. The tension between them was a taut wire, vibrating with things unsaid. "I'm here as long as the foundation is sturdy, Tiff. You know the drill." "I know," she murmured, a flicker of frustration crossing her features. "But I'm tired of drilling. My friends tell me I'm just waiting for a ghost, but I'm right here." Blue looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he reached out, his hand sliding behind her neck to pull her into a swift, intense kiss. It was a brief, searing contact, a collision of two people who understood that their time together was a borrowed commodity. When they broke apart, the silence in the garage was deafening. Tiffany pulled back, breathless, and turned toward the children with a playful, commanding edge. "All right, you two," she announced, her voice regaining its composure. "Uncle Blue and I have some urgent matters to attend to regarding the infrastructure of this garage. I need you to go to the utility bench and count every single screw in that spare parts bin. Every single one. Sort them by gauge, then report back." "A whole bin?" Isabella asked, her lower lip pouting. "Every one," Tiffany insisted, pointing toward the back of the garage. Once the kids had scurried off, their footsteps echoing against the concrete, Tiffany turned back to Blue. Her eyes searched his, the skepticism of her earlier comment warring with the raw desire she couldn't quite mask. "We need to fix the alignment on the storage rack," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's been rattling for weeks, and I haven't been able to decipher the manual. It's an absolute mess of schematics, and I need someone with a steady hand to help me make sense of it." Blue smiled, a slow, predatory spark in his eyes that wasn't for the kids or the science project. He stepped closer, leaning in to whisper near her ear. "I'm an expert at alignment, Tiffany. Let's see what we're working with." He knew the cycle was ending. He could feel the shift in the wind, the way the house seemed to exhale as the kids busied themselves with the tedious task of counting hardware. He didn't ask for a tomorrow. He simply focused on the next 60 minutes of reality. In the corner, Mason and Isabella were already deep in debate over a half-inch wood screw, their voices rhythmic and focused. Outside, the sun began to dip, casting long, dramatic shadows across the driveway. Blue watched the light play across the wall, thinking about the ledger in his pocket, the list of names, the list of lessons, the map of his own restlessness. He was a nomad who planted seeds in gardens he would never harvest, and for now, that was enough. "You know," he murmured to Tiffany, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back as they turned toward the back of the garage, "if you count the screws long enough, you realize they're the only things holding the whole world together, even when it feels like it's falling apart." Tiffany didn't answer. She just walked beside him, the distance between them closing until they were moving as one, leaving the science project and the rest of the world behind. Scene 32. Naomi and the neighborhood kids. The morning air in the cul-de-sac felt thin, charged with the kind of electric anticipation that only preceded the arrival of a legend. Uncle Blue stood by the trunk of his SUV, his posture relaxed, yet his eyes scanned the perimeter with the precision of a man who treated every environment like a tactical puzzle. He adjusted his collar, feeling the familiar weight of the encrypted ledger tucked into the interior pocket of his jacket, a silent promise to a future he hadn't yet named. He breathed in the scent of damp pavement and freshly mowed grass, thinking about the fragility of the life he curated. Stability was an illusion, but momentum was the only truth. Logan, whom Blue knew as Rascal, and Charlotte or Pip burst through the front door of their home like human cannonballs. They didn't just run, they sprinted toward the driveway, their faces luminous with the knowledge that pizza was currently sitting in the back seat, cold but glorious. "Uncle Blue, you're finally back," Rascal shouted, skidding to a halt while clutching a neon orange frisbee. Pip mirrored his excitement, bouncing on her heels. "We've been waiting for ages. Did you bring the extra large?" Blue laughed, a sound that cut through the morning stillness. "I brought enough to feed a small army, but let's see if you two have the coordination to earn your lunch first." He pulled a professional-grade throwing disc from his duffel, flipping it in the air with a casual flick of his wrist. "Today, we aren't just throwing plastic, we're going to master rotational inertia." Naomi stepped onto the porch just as Blue signaled for the kids to head toward the wide, grassy patch of the side yard. She was dressed in a silk blouse that caught the sunlight, her eyes tracing Blue's silhouette with an intensity that bordered on hungry. She leaned against the railing, crossing her arms, her jaw tight. She had spent the last hour convincing herself she didn't need this, that his sporadic visits were a disruption. But the moment he looked up and caught her gaze, the argument she'd prepared in her head evaporated. "Rascal, Pip, move to the far side of the hedge," Naomi directed, her voice steady even as her pulse quickened. "I need to discuss something urgent with Uncle Blue. You two, take the indoor library cart and start organizing the books by color code on the back shelf. No excuses." The kids grumbled, but the mention of pizza waiting in the car kept their dissent to a minimum. They scurried off, eager to complete the task so they could claim their reward. Once they were alone, the atmosphere shifted. Naomi walked down the steps, her heels clicking against the concrete. She didn't stop until she was inches from him. "You're late," she whispered, though her tone held no real accusation. Blue dropped the frisbee, his focus sharpening. "I'm exactly on time for what matters, Naomi." She reached out, her fingers grazing his sleeve, and then suddenly her hand went to his nape, pulling him down. The kiss was desperate and sudden, a collision of suppressed longing. It was a silent, heated reconciliation for the days of absence, a brief, clean, and intense connection that left them both breathless. "You act like you're doing me a favor," Naomi said, pulling back but refusing to let go of his jacket. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the man who existed beneath the smooth talk. "I have a board meeting today for the regional logistics project. My career is a labyrinth, Blue. Every day feels like I'm trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing." Blue stepped closer, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Then stop playing the game by their rules. Logistics isn't just about moving goods from A to B. It's about understanding the velocity of the system. You're the smartest person in that building, and you know it." "I hate how you make it sound so simple," she countered, her voice softening into a genuine, vulnerable admission. "I keep telling myself I don't need a constant, but when you're here, the house feels like it has a pulse." "That's exactly what you wanted," Blue said, his voice low and firm. He took a steadying breath, grounding himself. "Remember why we're here, Naomi. Your life is yours to build. We're just dancing in the gaps." He turned his attention back to the yard. Rascal and Pip were watching from the window, their faces pressed against the glass. Blue signaled them to come out, his demeanor shifting back to the playful mentor. He grabbed the frisbee and began demonstrating the spin, showing them how the angular momentum kept the disc stable against the air resistance. "Watch this, Rascal. If you release it with a clean snap of the wrist, the air creates a gyroscopic effect," Blue explained, his voice projecting clearly. He stood behind Pip, helping her adjust her grip, his expression shifting into one of pure focused intensity as he taught her how to angle the throw. "Feel that resistance? That's the physics of flight. The disc wants to wobble, but your spin gives it authority. It refuses to drop because it has a purpose to stay airborne." Pip laughed as the disc sailed perfectly across the grass, hovering in a way that seemed to defy gravity. "That was great, and always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else," Blue called out to them. Naomi watched them from the porch, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. She watched him command the space, the kids, and the moment, realizing that for all his talk of momentum, he was the only thing in her orbit that actually stood still. "Uncle Blue," Pip yelled, "is it Mickey D's time yet?" "Soon, Pip, but first tell me what you learned about the library shelves," Blue said, jogging over to meet them, his eyes glinting with a secret pride. As he walked away, Naomi realized that while she had spent her life trying to organize everything into perfect, predictable shelves, she had finally found the one variable that made the chaos worth the trouble. She watched him joke with the kids, the sun setting behind them, wondering just how much of him she could actually keep before he inevitably moved on to the next household. Scene 33: Rascal and Pip's new skills. The late afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Naomi's living room, turning the hardwood into a canvas of amber light and dust motes. Outside, the world was a blur of suburban monotony, but inside, the air crackled with a kinetic, electric promise. Uncle Blue stood in the center of the room, his movements fluid and precise, as if he were measuring the very oxygen in the space. He wore a simple, charcoal gray athletic shirt that hugged his frame, his presence commanding yet entirely unforced. Naomi leaned against the doorframe of the kitchen, arms crossed, her eyes tracing the lines of his shoulders. She had spent the last 20 minutes watching him organize a stack of colorful soft foam floor mats he'd brought over, her pulse quickening with every deliberate, confident movement he made. She knew that in a few hours the house would be quiet, and the tantalizing, low-frequency hum of their unspoken arrangement would finally manifest into something more than just glances. She felt a phantom weight in her chest, a mix of thrill and the nagging familiar skepticism that she was merely a temporary harbor in his nomadic life. She pushed the thought away. It was too heavy for a day like today. Logan and Charlotte, whom Blue insisted on calling Rascal and Pip, erupted into the room, their energy a mirror of his own. They scrambled toward him, eager for the promised activity. "All right, you two," Blue said, his voice a rich, steady baritone that instantly anchored the chaos. "Today we aren't just jumping around. We're working on the physics of rotation. We're going to master the cartwheel. It's all about center of gravity and torque. You ready to defy a little bit of local gravity?" Logan, ever the energetic one, did a quick, shaky leap. "I'm ready, Uncle Blue. But why a cartwheel? Can't we just do flips?" Blue laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the corners of the room. "One step at a time, Rascal. If you can't control your body in a linear plane, you've got no business launching yourself into the air. First, tell me, what did you two learn in school today? And don't tell me it was nothing, because I know for a fact that your brains were working overtime." Charlotte stood tall, her hands on her hips, imitating the way her mother did when she was impatient. "We learned about the moon phases, Uncle Blue, the tidal locking. It's why we only see one side of the moon. It's caught in a gravity trap, like a dance where one partner never turns their back." Blue's expression shifted, his gaze turning serious and profoundly attentive. He knelt, coming down to her level. "That's fascinating. You're telling me the moon is effectively spinning once for every time it orbits the Earth? That's why the features stay the same?" "Exactly," Charlotte beamed, thrilled by his genuine curiosity. Blue stood up and reached out, tapping her gently on the shoulder. "That was great, and always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else." He turned back to the mats. "Now, watch this. It's about creating a kinetic chain." He demonstrated a slow, perfect cartwheel, his hands planting firmly, his legs extending in a graceful arc that seemed to hang in the air for a fraction of a second longer than should be possible. It was a display of pure, harnessed momentum. For the next hour, the room was filled with the sounds of soft thuds and the infectious laughter of children. Blue was patient, correcting their hand placement with a gentle touch, teaching them how to drive through their heels. Naomi remained in the shadows of the kitchen, watching them. She felt a surge of pride, not just for her children, but for the way Blue could turn an afternoon into a laboratory of movement. She walked over, carrying a tray of ice-cold lemonade. "They're getting the hang of it, aren't they?" she asked, setting the tray down. She looked at Blue, her eyes lingering on the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. She felt a sudden, sharp urge to reach out and touch his arm, to ground him in the present moment, to force him to acknowledge that they were here, together, in the quiet of this house. Blue took the glass she offered, his fingers brushing hers with a deliberate, slow friction. The air between them thickened, the sound of the children playing in the backyard suddenly seeming miles away. He took a slow sip, his gaze locked onto hers. "They're natural, Naomi. They've got the drive." "They get that from me," she murmured, her voice dropping an octave. "I think they get a lot of things from you," he whispered, stepping closer, the scent of fresh air and something uniquely him, a blend of cedar and ozone filling her senses. As the children sprinted toward the backyard to practice their new skills on the grass, Naomi leaned into him. The distance evaporated. She kissed him, a deep, lingering press of lips that spoke of the pent-up tension of the last few days. It wasn't just a greeting, it was an anchor. Blue responded with a fierce, quiet intensity, his hand resting firmly against her waist, pulling her into his space until there was no gap left between them. He pulled back, his eyes dancing with a mix of mischief and desire. "Naomi, those kids are going to be back in 5 minutes asking for more pointers." Naomi stepped back, a playful smile touching her lips as she smoothed her hair. "I've got that covered. I told them they need to count every blade of grass in the lawn, a scientific survey of local density. They'll be busy for at least an hour." Blue raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed. "Efficient. I like that." "We have more pressing matters," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid rhythm of her heart. "The living room floor tiles have been feeling a bit uneven lately. I'm concerned about the structural integrity. I think we need to test them, thoroughly." Blue chuckled, a low, resonant vibration. "Structural integrity is a serious matter. I suppose I should take a look at the floor." "I think you should," she whispered, her gaze holding his with an intensity that promised more than just home repair. As they retreated together into the quiet sanctuary of the hallway, she knew the reality of their arrangement was just a fragile shell around a core that was, for tonight, entirely, dangerously real. She wondered if he'd ever stay long enough to finish the repairs, or if the nomad in him would simply move on to the next set of tiles. For now, she chose to stay in the light of the uncertainty. Scene 34, Vanessa and the Backyard Games. The backyard was a patchwork of overgrown clover and patches of hard-packed earth, smelling faintly of honeysuckle and the lingering ozone of a passing storm. Uncle Blue stood in the center of the grass, his shadow stretching long against the peeling white paint of the porch. "So, why don't you think the squirrel is actually faster than you, Scooter?" Uncle Blue asked, his voice melodic and teasing. He leaned back against the weathered wooden fence, arms crossed, watching Elijah, whom he called Scooter, kneel in the dirt, panting. Beside him, Amelia, or Jellybean, was untangling a knot of jump ropes. Elijah wiped his forehead, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Because he just jitters. He doesn't move with a purpose. He just runs until he stops." Amelia stood up, adjusting her braids. "He's right, Uncle Blue. When you chased us earlier, you were different. You didn't just run. You turned the corner, like you knew exactly where the earth was going to be." Vanessa watched them from the kitchen window, her palms pressed against the glass. She felt that familiar, sharp tug in her chest, the one she only ever felt when he was hovering nearby, an anchor in her otherwise static life. She turned away from the window, glancing at the stack of old, dust-covered boxes cluttering the mudroom. Her heart was a frantic drum, caught between the desire for his permanence and the cold reality of the life she'd built for her children. "Right," Uncle Blue said, pushing off the fence. "Today, we are talking about rapid acceleration. It's not about how fast you run at the end. It's about how hard you push the ground at the very beginning. Put your hands on the grass, just like this." He dropped into a sprinter's crouch, his muscles coiling like steel cables. "Now, give me your best burst toward that oak tree." The children scrambled into position, their laughter echoing against the quiet suburban afternoon. For a moment, the world was just the rhythm of feet hitting soil and the sharp, instruction-heavy cadence of Uncle Blue's voice. Inside, Vanessa paced the kitchen floor. She felt the sudden, stinging sting of jealousy. not for the children, but for the ease with which he filled the silence she spent her nights trying to drown out with the radio. She walked to the back door, stepping out onto the deck. The sun caught the gold in her hair, turning her silhouette into a halo of shadow. "Uncle Blue," she said, her voice dropping an octave, heavy with a subtext that had been brewing for 3 days. "The kids need to learn that not every sprint has a finish line." Uncle Blue looked up, his eyes bright with a dangerous, infectious curiosity. He walked toward her, leaving the children to argue over who had touched the bark of the oak tree first. The tension between them was a tangible weight, a cold fire that made the air feel thin. "You're brooding again, Vanessa," he said, stopping just inches from her. He smelled of fresh-cut grass and ambition. "I'm not," she countered, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm tired of the gaps. I'm tired of counting the days until the next time you decide this house is the one that fits your itinerary." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his touch firm but infuriatingly gentle. "You knew the landscape when we started this, Vanessa. You told me yourself you were done with the picket fence fantasy, that you wanted someone who moved with the world, not someone who was buried by it." "I lied," she whispered, the confession hanging between them like a held breath. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The silence grew deafening, amplified by the distant drone of a lawnmower. "This isn't a lie," he murmured, before pressing his lips to hers. It was a kiss that tasted of unresolved arguments and desperate, quiet hunger. It was a collision of two worlds that knew they couldn't exist in the same space, yet refused to pull away. "Uncle Blue," Elijah called out, his voice small. "We're ready for the science lesson." Uncle Blue pulled back, his expression shifting from molten to clinical in a heartbeat. He turned toward the children, who were standing by the edge of the crawlspace hatch. "Elijah, Amelia, listen up. Today, you asked about movement, but what you really need to understand is gravity and momentum. The attic crawlspace needs to be cleared, not just cleaned, but organized by weight and density. The heaviest boxes go on the bottom to lower the center of gravity, and the lightest on top. Is that physics?" Amelia asked, eyes wide. "It's life," Uncle Blue said with a grin. "And while you're up there, I need you to find the old manual for the ceiling fan. It's a lesson in torque." Vanessa ushered the children toward the house, her eyes lingering on Uncle Blue's back. She felt the familiar sting of his upcoming departure, yet the thrill of the secret task he'd left for them kept the dread at bay. "What did you learn in school today, kids?" Uncle Blue called out as they neared the door. Elijah paused, his face lighting up. "We learned about the nitrogen cycle, how plants take what we breathe out and turn it into the air we need to survive." Uncle Blue knelt, catching Elijah's shoulder. "That was great, and always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else." As the children disappeared into the shadows of the attic, Vanessa turned back to him, her eyes searching his. "Grown-up things, then?" she asked, her voice steadying. "I need to decipher a series of patterns in the insulation lining," he said, his smile enigmatic and charming. "And I think you're the only one who can help me read the schematics." She looked at him, this man who lived in the spaces between their days, and realized that the void he occupied was the only place she felt truly awake. She stepped toward him, the weight of the day falling away, leaving only the sharp, electric promise of the next few hours. The backyard felt smaller now, a private theater where the play was only just beginning. Scene 35. Jellybean and Scooter learn. "Why would you ever think that a spring could hold a secret?" Uncle Blue asked, his voice low and vibrating with a playful challenge. He sat on the floor of the sun-drenched living room, his long fingers carefully coiling a thin, oxidized brass wire around a pencil. Vanessa stood by the arched doorway, clutching a ceramic mug that had long since gone cold. She watched him, her gaze lingering on the way the sunlight caught the sharp angles of his shoulders, then shifting to her children. Beside Blue, Elijah, whom Blue called Scooter, and Amelia, known to him as Jellybean, were hunched over a chaotic mountain of gears, cogs, and tiny wooden dowels spread across the hardwood floor. Vanessa felt a familiar, sharp pang in her chest, not of worry, but of a desperate, clawing desire for the routine to break. She walked over, setting her mug on the side table with a precise, metallic clink. "Elijah, Amelia," she said, her voice firm but underlined with the indulgence she always reserved for their chaotic mentor. "If you want to understand how Mr. Blue is building that machine, you'll need the workspace cleared. Go and organize my yarn collection in the pantry by color gradient. Start with the deep indigos and work your way toward the ochres. Now, please." The children groaned in unison, but the prospect of the promised Mickey D's dinner was clearly too potent to ignore. They scrambled up, racing toward the pantry, their laughter echoing against the high ceilings. Blue didn't look up as the children vanished, his focus entirely on the clockwork assembly. "You're running a tight ship today, Vanessa," he murmured, his eyes tracking the tension in her hands. Vanessa moved closer, her shadow falling over his work. "I'm tired of the clutter, Blue. It feels like this house is suffocating under the weight of things that aren't going anywhere." She knelt beside him, her dress shifting against the floorboards. She reached out, her fingers hovering near the wire, then pulling back. "Why are you here? Really? You come, you turn our world into a playground, and then you evaporate." Blue paused, the tension in his jaw muscles visible. He set the pencil down and finally looked at her. "I'm here because you invited me, and because we both know you'd be bored to tears if I weren't." He leaned in, the air between them thick with the scent of sawdust and the faint, citrusy tang of his cologne. "Don't pretend you want predictability. You'd have chosen a different life years ago if you did." "Maybe I don't know what I want anymore," Vanessa whispered, the skepticism in her tone battling with a sudden, overwhelming softness. He reached out, his hand wrapping firmly around her wrist, his grip grounding her. "You want to feel alive, and that's exactly what I'm here for." He pulled her closer, and for a moment, the world outside the living room, the bills, the endless chores, the haunting silence of an empty house ceased to exist. He kissed her, a deep, lingering press of lips that tasted of intent and shared secrets. It was a silent argument settled in a breath, a reconciliation of two people who knew the temporary nature of their geography but couldn't help the magnetism. In the pantry, Elijah and Amelia were in their own world. Elijah held a skein of yarn up to the dim light, frowning. "Mom always acts like the colors are fighting, doesn't she?" he asked, tucking a bright crimson thread into a neat pile. Amelia nodded, her small hands moving with surprising dexterity. "She's waiting for something to happen, I think. Like that clock thing Uncle Blue is making. She thinks if she organizes enough stuff, the time will finally start ticking the way she wants it to." She paused, looking at the door. "Do you think he's going to stay longer this time?" "He never stays longer," Elijah said, his voice surprisingly mature. "He just makes the time he is here count for double." Back in the living room, Blue pulled away, his forehead resting against hers. "Potential energy," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That's the secret, Vanessa. It's stored in the tension, in the waiting. If you let it go all at once, you get movement. If you keep it coiled, you just get potential." "And if it snaps?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "Then you build a better spring," he replied. The children bounded back into the room, their faces bright with accomplishment. "We finished the indigo pile," Amelia cheered. "Uncle Blue, tell us, what did we learn?" Blue stood up, offering a hand to Vanessa to help her rise. She took it, the contact still buzzing between them. He turned to the kids, his expression shifting into that intense, pedagogical focus he saved for their lessons. "Today," Blue said, gesturing to the half-finished mechanical toy on the floor, "you learned about potential energy. It's energy that is stored in an object because of its position or configuration. Like this spring I'm compressing, it's not moving, but it's holding enough power to spin these gears until they run out of steam. It's the energy of about to happen." "So it's like a rocket before it launches?" Elijah asked, his eyes wide. "Exactly," Blue said. He reached over and ruffled the boy's hair. "And you, Amelia, what did you learn?" Amelia thought for a moment. "That if you don't use the energy, it just stays stuck." Blue smiled, a genuine, radiant look that reached his eyes. "That was great, and always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else." He turned back to Vanessa, his gaze softening. "I need to get the Mickey D's. The order is probably sitting on the counter by now." Vanessa stepped toward him, her voice low. You're leaving after dinner, aren't you? To handle your grown-up things? The local clock tower mechanism is acting up, he said, a glint of mystery in his eyes. Someone needs to show the gears how to move again. Vanessa sighed, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. She knew he wouldn't stay, and she knew the reasons, the history, the complications. But for this one, singular moment, the potential was enough. Just make sure you're back by morning, she said. I have a new puzzle I need you to help me fix. I'll be here, Blue promised, already moving toward the door. The energy is only just starting to build. Scene 36, Simone and the kids together. The gravel in the driveway crunched with a familiar, rhythmic satisfaction as Uncle Blue pulled his faded blue sedan to a halt. The evening sun cast long, amber shadows across the suburban expanse of Simone's home, turning the asphalt into a warm stage. Before he even managed to kill the engine, the screen door swung wide, clattering against the siding. Oliver and Harper burst onto the porch like kinetic energy unleashed. Uncle Blue! Uncle Blue! Oliver yelled, his sneakers thumping against the concrete. Beside him, Harper danced in place, her eyes bright with the expectation of the afternoon's inevitable surprise. Simone followed them, leaning against the doorframe, her posture relaxed yet watchful. She wore a soft, slate-gray linen dress that caught the breeze, her hair pulled back just enough to show the line of her throat. She didn't say a word, but her gaze lingered on Blue with a heavy, unspoken intensity that made the air between them feel suddenly thick, like the moments just before a summer thunderstorm. Blue stepped out of the car, stretching his arms high, his smile wide and infectious. Who's ready to turn this driveway into a flight lab? He shouted, pulling two professional-grade frisbees from his back seat. Me! Me! Harper chirped, bouncing on her heels. Zap, Nugget, get ready to learn the physics of the lift, Blue said, crouching down to their level. He handed a disc to each of them. Today, we aren't just tossing plastic. We're studying Bernoulli's principle. See, when you throw this right, the air pressure on top is lower than the pressure underneath, which creates lift. That's how planes stay in the sky. Inside the house, watching through the living room window, Simone felt a familiar tension coil in her stomach. She watched Oliver, whom she strictly called Oliver, tilt his head as he listened to Blue's instruction. It was a beautiful, chaotic tableau, the man who existed in the gaps between her responsibilities, teaching her children things the textbooks at school skipped over. She turned toward the kitchen, her thoughts drifting to the mounting pile of household repairs, but her mind was entirely on the way Blue moved, with a casual grace that made her own life of rigid schedules feel thin and brittle. Back in the driveway, Blue stood behind Oliver, gently adjusting the angle of the boy's wrist. Keep your thumb firm, Zap, like you're shaking hands with a ghost. Not too hard, not too soft, just enough to keep it steady. He walked over to Harper, placing a hand on her shoulder to steady her stance. Nugget, don't look at the sky. Look at the horizon. If you aim for the clouds, the disc gets lonely. Aim for the horizon, and it'll travel for miles. Oliver cocked his arm back, his tongue poked out in concentration. He released the disc, and it wobbled, then leveled out, soaring in a perfect flat arc until it clattered against the chain-link fence. Nice arc, Zap! Blue cheered, clapping his hands. So tell me, what did you two learn in school today? Something better than nothing? Oliver paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. We learned about the Great Emu War in history class. Apparently, the Australian government deployed soldiers with machine guns to stop emus from eating the crops, but the emus were so fast and spread out that the army actually lost. Blue threw his head back and laughed, a hearty, resonant sound. An army losing to a flightless bird? That is legendary. It just goes to show that sheer numbers and speed can outmaneuver even the most heavy-handed plans. He looked at Harper, who nodded vigorously. Nugget, what about you? We learned that honey never spoils, Harper added, her voice high and proud. Archaeologists found pots of honey in ancient Egyptian tombs that were thousands of years old and still perfectly edible. Blue knelt, his face softening with genuine awe. That is incredible. It's like nature's own time capsule. He stood up, looking at both of them with a serious, sharp intensity. That was great, and always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe. but you will be light years ahead of everyone else. As the sun dipped lower, casting the driveway in shades of bruised purple and gold, Blue watched the kids chase their discs. He signaled to Simone, who had stepped onto the porch. She caught his eye, a slow, knowing smile spreading across her face. "All right, you two," Simone called out, her voice firm but warm. "Oliver, Harper, bring the gear inside. It's time to start dinner, and Uncle Blue and I have some very grown-up things to discuss. The main circuit in the house is acting up, and we have to recalibrate the entire household's lighting system from the basement up." The kids groaned in unison, but they knew the rules of the house. They scrambled to gather the frisbees, darting inside and leaving the driveway quiet. Blue approached the porch, the distance between them closing until the scent of cedar and ozone hung in the space he occupied. Simone reached out, her fingers grazing his jawline, the touch both fleeting and searing. She pulled him close, her lips finding his in a kiss that tasted of quiet desperation and electric potential. For a second, the world seemed to stop. No less schedules, no lessons, no nomadic arrivals, just the reality of the two of them. She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, her expression unreadable. "You're always just passing through, aren't you?" she whispered. Blue held her gaze, his thumb tracing the soft skin of her cheek. "You know how this works, Simone. This is what you said you wanted. You told me you were done with anything heavy, that you just wanted someone to keep the life in this house moving while you found your footing." Simone sighed, the reality of her own words hanging in the air between them like a ghost. She leaned her forehead against his, closing her eyes. "I know," she murmured, "but sometimes, for a moment, I forget that you aren't staying." Scene 37, Zap and Nugget's energy lesson. The afternoon sun filtered through the sheer curtains of Simone's living room, casting long, dusty parallelograms across the hardwood floor. Outside, the world was a dull hum of suburban regularity, but inside, the air crackled with the kind of kinetic energy that only followed Uncle Blue's footsteps. He stood in the center of the rug, a bright red balloon held between his palms like a fragile, pressurized secret. Simone leaned against the doorframe of the kitchen, watching him. She had spent the morning trading her usual composed professional attire for a soft, emerald-colored silk blouse that clung to her silhouette, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She felt a familiar, sharp tug in her chest, a mix of thrill and terrifying uncertainty. She wasn't supposed to feel this way about a man who belonged to the horizon, yet every time he walked through her door, her structured life felt like it was being sanded down to its raw, exciting edges. "All right, Zap, Nugget," Uncle Blue said, his voice rhythmic and warm as he gestured toward the balloon. "Today we aren't just playing. We are summoning the hidden fire of the universe, or, more accurately, the electron exchange." Oliver, who Uncle Blue called Zap, tilted his head, his eyes bright with curiosity, while Harper, known as Nugget, hopped from one foot to the other. "Is it magic, Uncle Blue?" Harper asked, her ponytail bobbing with her excitement. "It's better than magic, Nugget. It's physics," Uncle Blue replied. He rubbed the balloon vigorously against his wool sweater, the faint sound of friction filling the room like a tiny rhythmic storm. "Ask me what you learned in school today. Don't tell me nothing or good, or we're going to be here until the streetlights come on." Oliver looked at his shoes, then up at the ceiling. "We talked about why the sky is blue. Mr. Henderson said it's because of light scattering. The sunlight hits the atmosphere and the molecules bounce the blue light around more than the other colors because it travels in smaller, shorter waves." Uncle Blue's face softened, losing its playful edge for a brief, genuine moment of pride. He stepped forward and tapped Oliver on the shoulder. "That was great, and always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else." He turned back to the balloon, pressing it against Oliver's hair. When he pulled it away, the boy's curls stood straight up, defying gravity. The kids erupted into laughter, their high-pitched giggles echoing off the walls. In the kitchen, Simone watched the scene, her heart performing a slow, steady drumbeat against her ribs. She was tired of the silence of her house, tired of the way she had to keep her emotions locked in a vault. But then Blue looked up. He caught her eye across the room, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath hitch. It wasn't just attraction, it was an acknowledgement of the vacuum they both lived in. She walked toward him, the hardwood floor quiet under her feet. As she reached his side, she whispered, "The kids are getting too good at this. They're starting to ask questions I can't answer." "That's the point, Simone," Blue said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur that barely carried over the kids' continued shrieks of delight. He leaned in, the scent of cedar and clean rain clinging to him. "Chaos is just information you haven't processed yet." Simone reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of his sleeve, her skepticism warring with the pull of his proximity. "I told my mother I was done with complications," she murmured, her voice laced with the vulnerability she kept hidden from everyone else. "I told her I was waiting for someone who could offer a blueprint, not just a weekend." Blue didn't pull away. He looked at her with a depth that felt almost heavy. "You know why this is the way it is, Simone. You told me yourself. The trust issues you've built, the way you've carved out this life where no one else is allowed to set down roots. This is what you wanted, a storm that doesn't knock the house down, just rearranges the furniture." She looked at him, searching for a sign that he might change his mind, but found only the honest, bright reflection of her own desires. She closed the distance between them, ignoring the kids for a fleeting, stolen moment. She pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart, and leaned up to meet his lips. The kiss was slow, deliberate, and tasted of unspoken promises, a deep, grounding pressure that made the rest of the world vanish to a gray, insignificant haze. It was a brief, searing crescendo, a moment where the vacuum finally filled with something solid. When they broke apart, breathless and slightly flushed, Blue turned to the children with a grin that held no trace of the heavy conversation they'd just shared. "All right, you two," Blue announced, his voice booming with regained authority. "I need to calibrate the atmospheric pressure in this room," which is a very scientific way of saying, "I have to talk to your mom about something incredibly complex. It involves the structural integrity of your shoe collection. I need you to go into the hallway and organize every single pair of shoes by color and style. Use the entire floor. If the laces aren't tucked in, the experiment is a failure." "But Uncle Blut," Oliver started. "No buts, Zap. The laws of science demand order." Blue winked at them, shooing them toward the hallway with a playful wave. As the kids scurried away, their chatter filling the hallway with the sound of shuffling sneakers and competitive sorting, Simone turned to him, a faint, wry smile touching her lips. "Organizing shoes? Really? That's your grown-up excuse?" "It's a very complicated system," Blue said, his eyes dancing as he gently steered her toward the living room chairs. "I'm currently trying to decipher a secret family recipe for the perfect Sunday morning breakfast, and it requires absolute silence and the lack of tiny, energetic assistance." Simone laughed, a sound of genuine release, and sat down, watching him. "You're an impossible man, Blue." "Impossible is just another word for infinite," he replied, and for a heartbeat, he looked at her not as a nomad, but as someone who understood exactly what it meant to be held by the things you were trying to escape. She looked at him, feeling the sharp, beautiful tension of the moment, wondering how much longer she could keep living in the space between the silence and the storm. Scene 38, Tanya and the kids' surprise. The air inside Tanya's living room hung heavy, thick with the scent of floor wax and the faint, citrusy tang of a thunderstorm rolling in over the valley. Outside, the sky was the color of a bruised plum, lightning stuttering against the horizon like a broken neon sign. Inside, however, the atmosphere was electric for an entirely different reason. Uncle Blue stood in the center of the room, tossing a soft, red foam ball toward the ceiling, his eyes tracing its arc with surgical precision. Tanya watched him from the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame with a glass of tea. Her pulse fluttered, a familiar, rhythmic thrum that only occurred when Blue was within a 5-foot radius. She smoothed her skirt, feeling the sharp, crisp fabric against her palms, and forced herself to look away before she lost her composure entirely. She knew he was heading out soon. She always did. It was the bargain they kept, a silent, fragile pact that she told her friends was merely a casual arrangement until she found someone with more financial gravity. Aiden and Evelyn Flash and Munchkin, as Blue called them, practically vibrated on the carpet. They loved the chaos he brought into their sterile, organized world. "All right, you two," Blue said, his voice dropping into that smooth, conspiratorial register that made Tanya's knees feel like unbaked dough. He caught the ball behind his back without looking. "We've got a problem. Gravity isn't just a suggestion. It's a law. And today, we're going to figure out exactly how it likes to play with our toys. Aiden, Flash, you ready to get moving?" Aiden, a sturdy 10-year-old with a penchant for dismantling clocks, bounced on the balls of his feet. "Ready, Uncle Blue? And you, Munchkin?" Blue turned to Evelyn, who was busy trying to balance a coaster on her nose. "Ready," she squeaked, dropping the coaster and lunging toward him. "Good. So, catch," Blue said, tossing the ball to Aiden. "But here's the trick. I want you to drop the ball from the same height every time, and then I want you to jump at the exact moment it hits the floor. We're mapping the reaction. What did you learn in school today, by the way? No slacking." Aiden paused, the ball hovering in his grip. He frowned, deep in thought. "We talked about the center of mass in gym class. My teacher said if you lean forward when you're sprinting, you move faster because your weight is ahead of your feet, pulling you into the movement." Blue clapped his hands, a sharp, resonant sound that made the room seem to shrink. "That is outstanding. You're talking about overcoming the inertia of your own stillness. Most people wait for the world to move them, but you're using your own mass to hunt momentum. That was great. And always remember, if you learn something new every day of your life, you won't even know 1% of what goes on in the universe, but you will be light years ahead of everyone else." Evelyn watched them, her mind clearly racing. She grabbed a stray pillow and held it over the sofa. "If I drop the ball and the pillow at the same time, they hit at the same time because gravity pulls everything down at the same rate, right? Unless there's air resistance." Blue's grin widened, glowing with genuine pride. He leaned over, ruffling her hair. "Look at you, solving mysteries before dinner. You're absolutely right. It's about the constant acceleration of the Earth's field, independent of the mass of the object. Keep that brain of yours sharp, Munchkin." Tanya stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The tension in the room shifted, turning from intellectual play to something raw and adult. The kids, sensing the change in their mother's demeanor, went quiet. "I have a task for you two," Tanya said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. She pointed toward the den, where stacks of heavy, leather-bound encyclopedias sat in unruly piles. "The library is a mess. I need them sorted by year, oldest to newest. It's a heavy job, but I know you two are strong enough to manage it." Aiden and Evelyn exchanged a look, the kind of look that said they knew exactly when to vacate the room, and hurried off toward the den without a single complaint. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the distant rumble of thunder. Blue turned to Tanya, his posture relaxing into a fluid, confident slouch. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, his presence dwarfing her. "You look particularly radiant tonight, Tanya," he murmured, his gaze dipping to hers. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks. "It's been a long few days, Blue. The house feels too quiet when you're not here." He reached out, his hand gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered there, grazing the sensitive skin of her neck. "I only go where I'm needed, and I'm definitely needed here." "Are you?" she whispered, searching his eyes for the truth, for a sign that he might stay longer this time. "My friends think I'm crazy, you know. They say I should be looking for a man who doesn't have a map of the state burned into his gas tank." Blue sighed, a soft, weary sound. He pulled her close, his hands settling firmly on her waist.